The book of Ruth is quite unusual in the Bible because it's a story about ordinary people. So much of the Bible is taken up with these big characters. Think back to Genesis. You've got Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the 12 sons that he has. Or in the book of Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, Moses is a huge figure. In the book of Joshua, it's dominated by Joshua's leadership as the people enter the promised land. But Ruth, two women, two pretty ordinary women, Naomi and Ruth, are at the heart of this story. And it tells us about God's care for ordinary people and how God achieves his purposes using ordinary people. It's an encouragement to you and me who are not the great leaders. And it's a story told in varying speeds of time. Think of how movies or TV shows work by varying the speed time travels at. A whole lot of a film or a TV show might concentrate on just a very short period. And other periods of time might pass at pretty high speed. So we might see a character in a particular situation and then we don't see them until months or even years later. Now that's what's going on here in the book of Ruth. The author's telling us what's really important to the story by the amount of space they give to it. So in chapter 1 verses 1 to 5 we cover at least 10 years in 5 verses. And this is very much scene setting stuff. Verses 7 to 18 we cover just a few days as they start to journey back to the land of Judah. And the focus in verses 8 to 18 is on one conversation that's critical to what's going on. And that takes the bulk of the chapter we've read. And that's the heart of what's going on. Then in verses 19 to 22, we get the journey to Bethlehem from Moab. Perhaps a week, it depends on the mode of transport, whether they had a donkey to ride. And even then, from the middle of verse 19 to verse 21, the focus is on one conversation again between Naomi and the women of Bethlehem. So it's a story where the speed time runs at varies, and that signals what's really important. And it's a story told using key words. Did you notice how many times you get return, go back, turn back, return, go back, turn back in this passage? It's really striking, isn't it? And one of the things to look for is who is returning and where they're returning and why. So let's look at this story through the eyes of the two women. We'll look at through Naomi's eyes first and then look through Ruth's eyes. Let's start with Naomi. Verses 1 to 5 lay out an absolutely tragic situation. She and her husband Elimelech have left the land of Israel, the land of Judah, to go to the country of Moab because of a famine, verse 1. Now it's not wrong to migrate because of famine. Abraham does it in Genesis 12 when he goes to Egypt. Isaac does it in Genesis 26 when he goes to Gerar. But going to Moab is a bit strange because the Moabites were traditionally enemies of Israel. The Moabites were descendants of Lot, Abraham's nephew, after he had drunken incestual sex with his daughters in Genesis 19. And when the Israelites had been travelling back from slavery in Egypt to the Promised Land, in Numbers 21, the Moabites had refused to help them. During the time of the Judges, in Judges chapter 3, the Moabites had conquered and oppressed the Israelites. And we know from 1 Kings 11 that they worshipped a god called Chemosh. And Chemosh approved of human sacrifice, which the Israelites certainly didn't. So Ruth and Naomi are in a strange situation. Naomi is in a land where the God of her ancestors, the Lord, is not worshipped. But she's a woman who engages with the situation. Did you notice how many times in this section from verse 6 onwards that Naomi initiates action? She doesn't just sit back and let stuff happen to her. She acts. So in verse 6, she started to return. In verse 7, she set out. In verse 8, she speaks, and again in verse 11 and in verse 15. In verse 18, she recognises Ruth's determination not to return to Moab. And now she stops speaking. She said no more, verse 18. Then in verse 22, Naomi returned. And it's harvest time. The beginning of the barley harvest in verse 22. Now that's a huge contrast with her departure in verse 1, isn't it? In verse 1 they leave with famine and she returns at harvest. But in verse 1 she left with her family, Elimelech and their 2 sons, and in verse 22 she returns with just Ruth. But there's a hint here in the shift from famine to harvest that something is going to happen that's good. Another thing to notice about Naomi is that she's a woman who hears and speaks about God, but she doesn't seem to speak to God very much. She says the Lord has helped his people in verse 6. She recognises that that's happened, and so she wants to go back. In verses 8 and 9, she wishes God's blessing for her 2 daughters-in-law. May the Lord deal kindly with you. The Lord grant that you may find security. So she wishes God's blessing for her 2 daughter-in-laws. In verse 13, she understands events through faith. Not in a good way here, because she says the hand of the Lord has turned against me. In verse 20, she says that the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. In verse 21, she says the Lord has dealt harshly with me and brought calamity with me. The Lord has brought me back empty, she says. And that's a bit strange, isn't it? Because Ruth is standing there right beside her when she says this. She's saying God is doing things and they're not good things. But she's not following the pattern we find, for instance, in the Psalms of Lament, where the psalmist expresses their pain and their frustration to God because God is big enough to take it and he's big enough to do something about it. I wonder how we respond when the bottom seems to fall out of our world. What do we do? How do we respond? Do we respond with Naomi and say, oh, it's all terrible and it's all God's fault and there's nothing that good can come out of this? Or do we actually speak to God like the Psalms of Lament do, and perhaps use some of those Psalms of Lament as our prayers to address God with these issues? Then Naomi is a woman whose experience is bitter. She says this in verses 11 to 13 when she urges Orpah and Ruth to go back to their own country. She says in verse 13, it's been far more bitter for me than for you because the hand of the Lord has turned against me. She doesn't want them to have her experience. She thinks God's got it in for her, and she doesn't want Orpah and Ruth to experience that too. And on her return in verse 19, the whole town is stirred because Ruth and Naomi arrived, and that's stirred with excitement. That's the sense of it here. But they ask the question, is this Naomi? We might put it, can this possibly be Naomi? I wonder if she looks older than her years at this point. And there's no evidence of welcome and help from the Bethlehemites. It's in chapter 2 verse 2 we'll discover that Ruth has to go and pick up leftover corn and grain in the fields in order to survive. That's a mark of a person in relative poverty. And it's only in the next chapter that Ruth proves to be a friend in need. Ruth finds Boaz to be a friend in need. However, it's really interesting, and we'll notice this when we focus on Ruth in a moment, that Naomi seems to have remained a worshipper of the Lord while she's in Moab. Remember, Chemosh is the god of Moab, but there's absolutely no mention of that god here. And the other books of the Old Testament don't hesitate to mention the names of the gods of the other countries. But not here. Ruth seems to have observed Naomi's faith and will want to commit herself to sharing it. So even though life has been tough, Naomi has held on to God, or we might better say, God has held on to her, and there's more to come for her.